let's dive into the Irish Sea for the next 30 minutes or so. So that's me for all of those who don't know me yet. I'm Scott Xavi Gudrich. I have a lot of fancy things behind my name because I spent a lot of time in the educational system. I'm a marine scientist and educator. I'm the founder of the Plover Rovers Marine Science Communication Charity. I have a master's in marine environmental protection, and I am very passionate about nature conservation. And I love dedicating my evenings to presenting exciting things like benthic fauna of the Irish Sea. So what is benthic fauna? And maybe even more importantly, why should we be so excited about it? So this picture here, if Google tries to explain it to me, Google always says it's a pizza, but it's actually not a pizza. It's a very cool worm that's crawling into the picture there. And before we get into the worms themselves, so before I go into all the different exciting species, just some important vocabulary. So we've got the benthos, which is the assemblage of organisms inhabiting the sea floor. We've got the infauna, which are the animals which live within the sediment. And we've got the epifauna, which are the animals which live on top of the sediment. So where do we find benthic fauna in the sea? And the answer is we find it absolutely everywhere, from the intertidal zone all the way down to the deepest depths of the deep sea. So benthic fauna is everywhere. Benthic ecosystems are extremely diverse, as you can imagine. You've got ecosystems up there in the intertidal zone, light and everything. You've got ecosystems down, way down in depth, in the absolute darkness, and everything in between. So that alone is already amazing, just where all the places that these critters can actually make a living for themselves. Why do we want to know about all these little cool animals? They're not the most spectacular animals on first glance. Maybe when we think about marine biology, I get this a lot, definitely, when you tell people you're a marine biologist, and people initially, of course, think about whales, they think about dolphins, they think about sharks, they think about all these poster animals of marine biology, but they don't tend to not think about little guys digging through the mud. So what's so important about them? The benthos is actually one of the main components of marine ecosystems. All these little organisms are on a very crucial level of the trophic web because they are on a very low level. So they're the guys who feed everyone else. And then, of course, if you study them, you get the, you're studying the food kind of thing. And there is some truth to that because they are very important in the trophic web. They are very important food source for all sorts of other animals. For example, seabird populations, but also all sorts of other marine animals depend on a healthy benthos. They also characterize local situations. So they give us a lot of information about the state and the functioning of an ecosystem. So this could be looking at different aspects of this. So it could be sort of a before and after thing. If we know that a certain benthic community has always lived somewhere, and then the next time we go there and we see it has massively changed, we know there must have been some changes in the environment that triggered that change in the benthic community. So they're an indicator for change. It could be natural changes, it could be changes like climate change, it could be a pollution incident that affected them. So they're really important indicator organisms to inform us about changes in communities. It can also tell us a lot about if an ecosystem is functioning well. If we've got, and we will see an example for that shortly, if we've got a benthic community that's very diverse, where you've got basically a lot of the roles in a healthy ecosystem filled by a lot of different animals, or if you have a very one-sided ecosystem where one species is extremely dominant, and that would show it's kind of out of balance and things aren't working so well. So it just is a really important indicator for what's going on locally. Also, this local aspect is actually quite interesting because often benthic communities are quite localized, which means they can give us information about a very local place, not just sort of the whole Irish Sea or the whole coastline, but actually we could look at one bay and look at the Benthic community there, and we could compare it with another community just in the neighboring bay, and we could see if they're the same or if they differ, and we could see if maybe one bay had a pollution incident and the other one didn't. So it gives us the possibility to compare things also on quite a small local scale. And the whole character and structure of the benthic community is going to reflect the conditions around it. So it's going to reflect natural conditions, but also it's going to reflect anthropogenic influences on these places. So just one example where we have looked at benthic communities and we get some information about climate change out of them. So this is a baseline map of the Barents Sea, looking at mega benthic communities, so relatively large animals. If we're talking about mega benthos, do not imagine sort of like mega does not mean huge. Mega just means not incredibly tiny. And this was done in 2011, and people were looking at similarity between benthic communities, and they're basically looking where is the benthic polar front line. So where are the species that are more sort of northern species, which would here be the green and the blue species, and the more southern species, which would be the yellow and red region. And the black full line is the benthic polar front in 2011. So when you now go back to this area and sample those communities again, you will be able to see if there are any shifts in communities. So we would expect, and there's already an area where more southern species are sort of moving towards the more northern areas, and this would be probably due to temperature changes due to climate change. So this would be very interesting to inform sort of long-term studies, seeing how the benthic communities change there as the climate changes and as water temperatures change, and what species are moving from the southern communities into the northern communities. And this can inform climate change science. Another example where we're looking at benthic communities would be, for example, effects of fish farming. So fish farms produce a lot of organic matter, fish poo, and there are certain marine worms, for example, capitalids, and they love to eat organic matter. So they will be very dominant in areas where there's a lot of fish poo. Many other species do not like to be smothered in poo. So typically these other species will disappear. For example, filter feeders, they won't be able to actually feed there, and the capitalids will dominate the fauna, and the biodiversity will be much lower than in an area without all of this fish poo. Just 1 second, admit and back up. I'm getting good at this. So we can look at benthos diversity, abundance, and biomass to assess the impact of fish farms. In this case, if we assess the biodiversity of the benthos under a fish farm, this can help evaluate to see how successful the measures are that this fish farm is undertaking to make the process more sustainable. So if they have, if they're, for example, using filter feeding organisms like mussels to clean up the water, or if they're not having a density of fish that is too high. So that would be one thing where you would use a very localized look at a very localized benthos, and you would actually compare that to an area really close by as possible that is not affected by the fish farm. So you could then compare the benthic communities, see what the normal biodiversity should be, and then see what it's like in the area that the fish farming is going on. Now, after this basic, just short description of why we should be looking at benthos, we should of course also look at it just because it's really cool. There's some really cool animals in there. And this is like a little guess who game we're gonna play here. And you will be allowed to unmute yourself now if you wish. What kind of an animal do you think this is? And I guess some of you maybe guessed what kind of animal this is. Does someone want to scream it out into the public? Otherwise, I can also say what it is.
Picniconid.
Yes, exactly. It's a picniconid, a sea spider. So these sea spiders, they're called sea spiders, but they're not actually spiders. Most of them are really relatively small. The only large ones are around the poles. Many are carnivorous, so they eat worms, jellyfish, sponges. They have a giant proboscis to suck up their food. I mean, giant as in, I mean, if they're small, obviously the proboscis isn't going to be that gigantic, but in relation to their bodies. Some have 8 legs, like spiders, but there's also ones with 10 or even 12 legs. And they have mainly legs. They don't really have much of a body. They're also called, the order they're in is actually called Pantopoda, and that means all legs. So they're all legs, no body. And that means they have all their organs basically in their legs. They also don't have, they don't need a respiratory system because their surface area is so optimized through this design of their body that they actually just can absorb oxygen through their legs, and then by diffusion, they get the oxygen into their blood. That's enough for them. They don't actually need to have a breathing apparatus. Good for them, they can't catch COVID. And there's about 1,300 known species of these guys. This is a specimen that was found in Cornwall. Then this guy, what type of animal is that? I guess it reminds everyone of someone we know from our gardens.
Isopod.
Yeah, that's an isopod, exactly. Isopods are an order of crustaceans. I just said there's about 1,300 species of sea spiders. There's over 10,000 species of isopods. So we're in a different level here. They're a very, very old type of animal. The first fossil record is in the Paleozoic, so that's 300 million years ago. That's what I needed my notes for. I'm not good with remembering numbers. 300 million years ago. They're actually an interesting species, or like not species, they're an interesting group because they are really entirely benthic and they're not very mobile because they don't really have free swimming phases in their development. So they're often very endemic to a certain place, which means it's also one of the reasons that there are over 10,000 species. And they can be quite telltale species to a certain community because they don't branch out much. Very many of them are parasitic on fish. Anyone who has worked in aquariums before probably knows that you have to really watch out for the parasitic isopods. They can become quite a problem in an aquarium tank. Many of them also live just free crawling on the floor, eating all sorts of detritus like the woodlice in our gardens do. Beautiful picture. All the pictures are by David Fenwick, by the way. I'm used by permission. He does amazing pictures. I have a link to his website in the end of the presentation. I really encourage you to check it out. Amazing photography. What kind of an animal do you think that is, or part of an animal that is?
Ophiuroid.
Yes, exactly. An ophiuroid, a brittle star. Guy from Plymouth here. Brittle stars, obviously closely related to starfish. About 2,000 species, of which over 1,200 live below 200 meters, so below the photic zone in the dark regions of the sea. And they're even older than the isopods. With the brittle stars, it's about 500 million years ago that the first fossils are found. They're found worldwide, from the poles to the tropics. And what's different from the starfish, from the asteroida, is that all of their organs are within that central disc. So whereas with starfish, you've got digestive organs that go into the arms, with these guys, everything is concentrated within that one disc, never anything in the arms. They have a very simple, relatively simple nervous system with one central nerve ring that goes once around the central disc. And they mostly, they don't have any specialized sensory organs. They don't have eyes, but they have very sensitive nerve endings in their epidermis, and they can sense chemicals in the water. And they can also sense probably the presence and absence of light. Interestingly, there's sensory bits, I always call them now, in their legs, where basically they have if they're in a crevice hiding out and they have the leg sticking out, and if then the light changes, they will pull it in. So it seems like they have some sensory apparatus in there which they can detect light with, and which makes them hide away then. They have also on their disc, they have their mouth and their anus, 2 in 1 system, so very practical, one hole in and out. They're scavengers and detrivores mostly, and they actually, other than not like the isopods who are very, very completely benthic and not so mobile, these guys actually do have a free swimming larval stage, so they can disperse a little bit better. They don't have to always crawl all their lives. And then we've got this beautiful guy. Of course, the little the stars of the benthic assemblage very often. And they're actually what we call them is, it's a little bit fuzzy sometimes, because I guess many people will say that's a sea slug. And the term sea slug is actually being used a little bit in a bit of a fuzzy way sometimes, because it's often used for nudibranchs, so the actual slug-like animals that never had a house. But then there's also pistobranchs, which other gastropods that used to have a house and just don't have a house that's clearly visible anymore because it developed away from that again. So, but we can call them all sea slugs. It doesn't really matter. Nudibranchs comes from the Latin nudus, which means naked, and the Greek brachia, which means the gills. And it's a typical thing that it drives you crazy, because I'm a studied classicist, so I studied classics, and it always drives me crazy when they mix Latin and Greek in the names. But it's just like my pet peeve. I don't approve of that. Don't like it. It's confusing. But well, that's just the way it is. It's okay. So the nudibranchs. Also, we get them worldwide. They're restricted to salt water. There's a couple of species, I believe, that also can live in brackish water, but they're generally they're marine species. They don't go elsewhere, not like the isopods, which even go on land, and also live in sweet water and in the groundwater and everywhere. Nudibranchs are really marine species. Almost all of them, there's about 3,000 species that are described. Almost all of them are benthic, except for these really cool guys of the glaucus type that actually live upside down under the surface of the water. So they adhere to the surface of the water, and they slide along underneath the surface of the water, which is cool. And they feed on the Portuguese man-o'-war, which is also pretty cool. And what they do there is that they eat the nematocysts and they incorporate them into their own bodies to use for defense. So that's something that nudibranchs can generally do, many of them, that when they eat like the stingy stuff, they actually can incorporate the nematocysts from the little stingies they're eating, and they use them in their own bodies for defense, which is very cool. They have relatively for all that, putting all that effort into like incorporating nematocysts and everything, they still have a pretty short lifespan. Actually, they live from some weeks to 1 year, and they're just very, very spectacular. And this guy here is from Cornwall, and sometimes it's almost surprising what kind of tropical looking animals we have in British waters. I think that's something, that's also something we're trying to do with the plover rovers. I think pointing out to people just the amazing stuff that we have in front of our door. You don't need to go to the tropical coral reefs. There's lots of nudibranchs there as well, and they look really awesome, but we've also got really awesome ones just here in British waters. What kind of animal is this? My favorites.
Psyllid.
Yeah, that is exactly. It's a psyllid, so it's a polychaete, and I think it's probably a psyllid. And psyllids are not particularly my favorite polychaetes because they're incredibly hard to. I think Becca will know what I'm talking about, but generally, so this is the guy from the first picture where Google thinks it's a pizza, Amblyopsilis formosa, so there's a psyllid, and that's a polychaete worm. And polychaetes are just amazing animals because they are so versatile. And this is why I have a slide saying, why are polychaete worms especially cool? Because they have glowing eyes and they're just amazing. Polychaete worms are worms with many bristles, polychaeta, many hairs. They don't look often particularly hairy on first glance, but they are really hairy. And they play an important role in churning over the bottom sediments in the sea. The borrowers, so many of them burrow into the sediment. They aerate the sediment, so they make it possible for more air to go in, and then they enable other organisms to live in the sediment because there's more oxygen available. They are, of course, an important food source. They can serve as indicator organisms, like we saw with the capitalids earlier, that like the fish poo that would say like this is a polluted space if you have like a very dominant capitalid community there. They're very important in benthic diversity assessments because you're often 2/3 of the animals that you're going to examine in a sample will be polychaetes. So they're just very, very central. I used to work as a benthic taxonomist, and polychaetes are just a very, very central part of your job if you do that. There are around 8,000 species of them, and their ways of life are extremely diverse. Some are hunters, swimming around freely. Others are sedentary filter feeders. Others are buried in the sediment. And that, of course, means that they have very, very different morphology. So they look extremely different from one another because they lead completely different lives. And it's, again, a little guessing game. What do you think, which lifestyle does this polychaete lead? Just look at how he's built.
Predator.
Yeah, he's a predator. Exactly. I mean, he has got these massive jaws. I mean, check out these jaws. An active hunter. He uses these little legs and the bristles to move around, so he can move around quite fast on the ground, and he can grab things with his jaws. There are stories of worms of the same family that grow quite big. And I know that there was a story somewhere that somewhere in the 90s, one of the bigger worms of this type had bitten off the balls of a swimmer. I could not verify this scientifically, but this is definitely an anecdotal thing that is going around the internet. Yeah. So anyway, you wouldn't want to have this hanging from your balls, especially not if it's a larger specimen, even if it maybe doesn't bite them off completely. But yeah, any case, well, I transgress. Next one, we have this guy. Which lifestyle, so completely different. What?
Filter feeder.
Yes, exactly. That's a filter feeder. Yasminera elegans. They filter food out of the water with the feathery crown. They live in a tube, so they don't need legs, not like the Oinike that we saw, who needs to move around quickly to chase their prey. They just live in a tube, doesn't need legs to move around, and just calmly filters out all the little things from the water around them. Then these are my personal favorites. Just love them. Not as obvious maybe as with the.
Is it a phyllodosid?
Yes.
Oh,
yeah.
I can never remember to say it. Phyllodosid?
Yeah, it's a phyllodosid, exactly. And these guys are they're also very active, so they can actually swim quickly. So the Oinikidae, they are more likely to crawl, whereas these guys can really swim with these paddles. Paddle worms, just gotta love them. so they can swim quickly and hunt their prey. And then we have this pretty guy. It's not going to win the beauty contest here. Where does this one live potentially?
Is that your capitalid?
Yeah, and that is a burrower, exactly. So that's an automastos, one of the most common ones. We get those a lot, and they don't need to move quickly. They burrow in soft sediments and just kind of pick up whatever food happens to be in front of them, just kind of like filter it through and get out whatever nutrients they can out of what they pump in. They have very reduced legs. They're quite muscular, so they can burrow through the sediment. They also don't need many hairs. So they're actually, you see the hairs are these little golden things that you can see there on the lower end of the big picture. That's their bristles that he has. And yeah, that's just a small insight into the wonderful world of polychaetes. That's back from when I was still working in the lab. That's the phyllodosid there that I met myself. And of course, what we also met a lot in the lab were plastic, microplastics and plastic beads. So I couldn't do this presentation without alerting to that pretty much in all samples, no matter if they came from the intertidal, if they came from the deep, if they came from urbanized areas like harbor areas, or if they came from marine protected areas, we were finding microplastics pretty much in all of them, unfortunately. So that's just something where if you actually work looking at these samples, it's still a different thing from just hearing it on the news when you actually keep seeing it day in, day out, how much of that stuff is actually in the samples. Yeah, and so thank you very much. All the photos, as I said, are by David Fenwick from his A Photo Marine website. Amazing, amazing photography. Do have a look at it if you like that sort of thing. It's really a lot. You can kind of go down that rabbit hole and just stay on his site for a long time. It's a nice thing to do if you're overworked and you just want to take your mind off things for a bit.